Professor Dr. Gilvan Oliveira is an associate professor at the Federal University of Santa Catarina and head of the UNESCO Chair in Language Policies for Multilingualism, based at UFSC, which involves 31 universities in 16 countries. He was the director of the Institute for Research and Development in Language Policy in Florianópolis, Brazil, and executive director of the International Institute of the Portuguese Language of the Community of the Portuguese Language Countries in Cape Verde, developing projects such as the Common Orthographic Vocabulary of Portuguese, associated with the 1990 Portuguese Orthographic Agreement, and the Portuguese as the Foreign Language Teacher Portal. His publications focus on language policies, particularly multilingualism and minority languages, and the social history of languages. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Gilvan Oliveira to address his keynote speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and an honor to be in Nagaland for the first time. I would like to congratulate the organizers of this event, especially in the person of Somi Roy and Mrs. Younger. And of course, for us linguists, it's very important and very pleasant to be in multilingual countries and multilingual situations like Nagaland. I thank you very much for the invitation. Our UNESCO Chair on Language Policies for Multilingualism has now a few years of work. As said, 31 universities in 17 countries, working in 11 different languages. That's much if we think that only 70 languages are used in the world for higher education. Less than 1% of the languages are used for higher education. So this hierarchical situation of languages is always in our focus of research. Our chair connected multilingualism in languages with questions that are important for the societies today. I mentioned internationalization, intercultural mediation, translation and accessibility, language education, economic and linguistic rights, information and communication technologies, borders, migrations, diasporas, and of course multilingual literatures, topic that we would like to develop today. My university is in South Brazil. We live on an island in South Atlantic. It's a university with 43,000 students that produces 600 PhD theses a year. Not all in multilingualism as we would desire, but of course it's a contribution for science. I would like to begin with a word, the word Kelkai. Kelkai is a word of the Quechua language. The Quechua language was and is a very important language spoken by around 6 million people in Peru, Bolivia. It was the main language of the Inca Empire before the arrival of Spaniards. And this word it's said to have been to draw or to make signs. The conquistadores recognized the meaning and changed the meaning and began to use the word for writing in alphabetic sense. If we jump from Peru to Mexico, much more to the north, we find this kind of book. This book has 39 pages. It is 11 meters long, and it describes divinatory rituals that mobilize hundreds of people at once. So, a small book, but a very important orality background that distribute roles, dances, singing, and other cultural activities, and organize all these groups that are participating in the rituals. From drawing to writing, the verbal story only serves as a metaphor for deeper changes. Just as an old meaning was obscured by a new meaning, Indian, it means indigenous oral culture, was also obscured by the use of European writings. Their diverse expression and memory techniques are now banished from public consciousness. The situation of those who cannot write is now generally understood as one of analphabetismo or illiteracy. So millions of people are illiterate because of the technology of writing and because of the techniques of colonialism on the other side. That's why we brought the words of our friend and colleague Lucila Otavalo, writer from Ecuador, poet in Quechua and Spanish, that mention how oral literature has a secondary place, a secondary role in dominant culture, although the abundant creative and sensitive imagination that has allowed the physical and cultural survival of these collectivities for so many centuries and today. We discussed some of these topics in Manipur in the first version, the first edition of this conference, and the words from Lucila Otavalo were there. She mentioned, of course, the colonial destruction of civilizations like the Inca and Aztecas. Each of them could have become what India represents today in terms of self-understanding and self-management of its cultural and literary values. They cannot, because the indigenous population of Mexico or Peru continues to be in a position where they don't have these possibilities. Centuries of silence and colonial appropriation of knowledge produced in the context of the Latin American continent produced invisibility and appropriation of this knowledge produced in indigenous languages. But we could ask, in contrast to the field of writing, where do you see orality? What is the place of orality and oral knowledge for the disciplines in our society that take care of these questions? Let's take three possibilities: folklore, anthropology, and intangible cultural heritage. Folklore. Folklore, as you know, is an expression of the 19th century romantic nationalism. What was the importance of folklore? Popular culture was a window into the past of a people, contrasting always with erudite culture, with the true artists of the dominant cultures. The idea of documenting cultural practice before it disappeared embedded the idea of the inevitability of its disappearance as an archaism. So folklore was interested in documenting the past, in finding in the past the connections of a people to their roots, to the nobilization of the history of a people through the popular roots of culture. Anthropology was born as a colonial management technique, restricted to the colony. There was no anthropology in the metropolis. So it had a complementary distribution to folklore. Folklore was applied to the popular classes of the colonial powers, and anthropology was applied in the colonies. It aims at a scientific description of human cultures as a whole and invested heavily in more formalizable relationships characteristic of sciences, such as kinship relationships, for example. Theoretical interests are very strong. That's why we can speak from functional anthropology, we can speak from structuralist anthropology, even a Marxist anthropology in some cases. And what about intangible cultural heritage? ICH aims to change the effective place of cultural products and producers. ICH, intangible cultural heritage, is not interested in the past, it's interested in the future. It's not interested in describing only culture. It's interested in changing the place of culture and bringing diverse kinds of equality to the discussion of culture. So, of course, I'm not making fully justice to folklore and anthropology. I'm making a simplification, just to contrast what is the interest for the past, what is interest for the present, and what is interest for the future. Of course, folklore and anthropology are two dialogue partners of ICH, the first dialogue partners that I would like to mention. Let's see what are the other partners of this area we are calling intangible cultural heritage. One second characteristic of ICH is its dynamicity. It's dynamic, constantly changing, contrasting with a more perennial and static character of material cultural heritage. So, if we think in the ground concepts of heritage, we must go back more than 250 years in the past, to the moment of creation, for example, of the British Museum in the middle of 18th century, one of the first that opened its collections to the public and preserve a wide range of cultural artifacts. More important even is the French Commission for Historical Monuments, created during the French Revolution, that was a precursor to modern policies for the preservation and conservation of cultural heritage. Many of the concepts that you use in ICH come from this material heritage. So that would be the second partner, dialogue partner from ICH, the long history of considering buildings, bridges, forts, and other milestones of human memory and history as important an element of conservation. For safeguarding of the intangible cultural heritage, we must mention the Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage to 2003. But of course, it was already a product of many practices, many experiences that the member states of UNESCO had had. For example, India. India began to consider heritage few years after independence. Since the 50s, India has many programs for heritage. So I would mention this convention as a product of the effort, of the national effort of countries to organize the field, to develop concepts, to bring innovation, and to make this field wider and wider every decade. Intangible cultural heritage is and brings and forms identity, recognizing, safeguarding, and celebrating cultural practices, traditions, knowledge, and skills that are passed down from generation to generation and are considered vital to the cultural identity of communities and societies. But what is the difference between culture and identity? We could say that cultures are the beliefs, the interactions, the organizations of the way of life of peoples. For identity, people take some elements of cultures, more elements or less elements, or only one element. Sometimes identity is only religion. Sometimes identity can be only language. Sometimes identity is exactly what our neighbor is not. Is the difference to our neighbor, the contrast to the other, the establishment of borders between us and the others. One important characteristic of intangible cultural heritage is it does not belong only for the people that produce this cultural heritage. It belongs to everyone. It belongs to the nation. It belongs to the world. It has a universal character. It is a lesson for humanity. Each one is a lesson for humanity. That's why UNESCO mentioned that ICH is a peace strategy. Why a peace strategy? Because strong identities, exclusivist identities based on the love for oneself, led to conflicts as they dehumanize other human experiences. ICH takes place in collective multilateral context. At the same time that I celebrate my tradition, I celebrate the tradition of the others. I celebrate the diversity of traditions. We cannot consider ICH alone, but always in the context of multilateral relations and relations with the others. That's why international cooperation is the field where ICH realizes its full potentialities. ICH needs a methodology, how to register, how to identify, safeguard, and use ICH in education and awareness. So, identification and registration produce many scientific approaches how to register these goods, these items, these products, with ethnographic studies, interviews and surveys, with specific guidelines. Safeguarding need other kind of measures, is made after registration and identification. It may involve creating museums, cultural centers, promoting festivals and events that celebrate traditions, like here, for example. In that point, data sovereignty is a very sensitive point. How can the community keep ownership, control, have the management of the intangible cultural heritage, and especially how can the community keep the benefits, the economic, political, sociological benefits of ICH. The data sovereignty is being discussed in many contexts. Diverse proposals are on the table for sovereignty, and especially open database connected to UNESCO as the UNESCO Atlas of World Languages are a guarantee that this sovereignty could be kept. Then education and awareness. How can we include this topic in school curricula? I see here so many students. Do we have in your faculty, in your courses, discussions and uses of intangible cultural heritage? Could we have this approach in education? The fostering of community participation as a strategic point to guarantee intergenerational transmission of the knowledge, for example, is a sensitive point. Considering 2 points of view, 2 strategies for recognizing ICH. On one side, the monumentalization of masterpieces, considering that some products are really heritage, but not all of them. And on the other side, the valorization of the process of production, the valorization of artists, the permanent stimulus to the production, the building of audiences, and the circulation of goods on a permanent basis. My question, to come to the last part of the speech, is: can languages be intangible cultural heritage? If we see the history of this topic, we see that intangible cultural heritage keeps expanding, keeps including new objects, new relations, new possibilities. Till sometime in the past, people would see that languages are just the repository of cultural heritage, not languages themselves were heritage. But now this topic is expanding, and we had in Brazil one of the first experiences in the field through the National Inventory of Linguistic Diversity, created 2010. It was a very tense begin, because the Service for Heritage had many difficulties considering languages as heritage. How should it be done? There were no other experiences before that we could follow. So the idea was to take the languages that are constitutive in the history of the nation and to consider them as a heritage, to create a policy for documentation, a strategy for mobilization of language communities. It took 5 years, since 2005 till the federal decree of 2010 that has created the system. In a country like Brazil, with 180 different indigenous languages, 56 immigration languages that are already in the country 200 years or 150 years, 120 years. 22 sign languages, many of them indigenous sign languages, and 1 official sign language. Brazil has 2 official languages, Portuguese and Brazilian Sign Language, besides Afro-Brazilian languages and Creoles. But very differently from India, in Brazil, 98.5% of citizens speak only Portuguese. So this big number of languages are spoken by less than 2% of the population, and still they are there, and still they are citizens. So Brazil is the 9th most multilingual country in the world, but has 98% of monolingual population. Let's see what the federal decree says as kind of inspiration for our discussion. First is that languages must have the character of relevance for the memory, history, and identity of the groups that make up Brazilian society. So, the decree recognized that there are groups in the society. In that case, linguistic communities are there. Second, it understands the national inventory as an instrument of identification, documentation, recognition, and valorization of languages, referred to identities and memories of different groups. In that case, when we see the guidelines for recognizing languages in the National Inventory of Linguistic Diversity, it's not very far from what UNESCO has developed after for the UNESCO World Atlas of Languages. In this case, we have similar questions, similar demands. Where is the language spoken? Who are the people that speak the language? Which is the territory where the language is spoken? Which are the productions in literature, in music, in other cultural aspects in that language? How the language is present on internet and digital world? So, these questions lead to concrete establishment of the universe of these languages. The UNESCO World Atlas of Languages that was developed after 2017. Now many countries are working in the introduction of its data. I am the focal point for the introduction of Brazilian data in the Atlas. We have the opportunity to compare the policies for ICH and the UNESCO Atlas of World. Last one. What happened to the languages that are represented or are recognized as heritage? They receive a diploma, they receive a title of Brazilian cultural reference, and governors, you would call it chief ministers of states, in our case we call them governors, receive a notification of the Ministry of Culture. In your state there is a cultural reference, a language that is considered an intangible cultural heritage, and you have responsibilities for the safeguarding of this language. This involves notifying states, municipalities, and other territories about the necessity of keeping control on these languages. The first one was, the first language to be recognized was the Guarani language, Guarani-Mbua language. Guarani is another big language in South America, spoken in Paraguay, Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, for more than 6 million people. It's a macro language. It means it has sub-languages inside, not dialects, but other smaller languages inside a macro language. That's a concept used in case like that. The language is spoken in 6 states, in an area of 800,000 square kilometers in South Brazil, by only 11,000 people. But it was the first pilot study that conducted to the establishment of the guidelines that made possible after the recognition of other languages. Till now, we have 19 recognized languages. The work time for making the inventory of each one is 1.5 years, around 1.5 years. Every year the government establishes some fundings for recognizing new languages. Decentralized teams work in these different languages and bring the possibility of collecting the data and establishing the report. One of the main difficulties for including languages as ICH is that heritage is always selective. Not everything is heritage. Only few things are heritage. But how can we say that only some few languages can be heritage and the others not? So, languages break the structure of thinking from ICH. languages bring an innovation, conceptual innovation for ICH, because all languages are important for their communities. All languages are fundamental for the production of culture. So we cannot let any language outside. That was the main conceptual problem for the service that worked with ICH. How to understand that every object, in that case, every language is a heritage and not only few like we have in other cases. So, because it maintains, ICH keeps expanding, new concepts, new breaks and new structures of thinking are coming to the center of discussion. Second question is, what languages represent the country? In many countries, only indigenous languages are represented as heritage. It's the case of Mexico. It's the case of Bolivia. They have communities of immigration that have contributed to the building of nation, but they are not recognized. We had a different policy in Brazil. The government decided not to create any barrier to the inclusion of Brazilian languages in the inventory, even immigration languages. So, in our case, German is the Brazilian language and is a cultural reference for Brazil. Why? Because German is spoken in Brazil since the moment of the independence. And the German-speaking people, today around 5 million, have contributed to build the nation. So, African languages that came with slavery, immigration languages that came and worked for the nation, and indigenous languages, Creoles that have been created in the country, and even border languages that keep the contact between us and our neighbors can be included. So, our policy is a policy of including all languages, and it contrasts very strongly to other countries that have a very specific idea of themselves. What means to be Indian and what should be considered Indian languages is a decision of the country. What are Mexican languages is a decision of Mexico. And so we have here many possibilities in the intangible heritage to consider the image of the nation and how the nation is capable of including or not different groups and different sociological experiences. The mother tongue of my mother is that one, Hunsrückisch. My mother was very repressed not to speak her language when she was a child. She spoke only this language till she was 6 years old. Then she went to the school, and the school has forbidden my mother to speak the language. She never more in life spoke the language, and I didn't have this language as mother tongue. But after my mother died, we could work in the program of recognizing Hunsrückisch as a Brazilian language and as intangible cultural heritage of Brazil. What delighted me very much, because it was the language my mother could not speak because the state did not recognize and repressed her experience. So, all languages as cultural reference, but identity discussions are there to be made, of course. The last question is, if all languages in the country can be ICH, how to proceed? How can we work with a so broad basis of communities and languages? So, in our experience, the methodology is the state does not take the initiative to include a language. The state does not include any language. The state waits that the community mobilize and through letters of agreement, letters of support, initiate the proceedings. So what happens? community mobilization is necessary. And what our experience shows is that when one community begins, other communities want to begin as well. It's a kind of gamification of intangible cultural heritage. More and more communities desire to be recognized and mobilized and create channels of dialogue with the government and possibilities of financing the effort so that all languages can be included. Nagaland is a very multilingual state in a very multilingual region inside a very multilingual country. So a wonderful laboratory of possibilities for multilingualism. And I hope that ICH can help you, as it helped us, to develop new approaches for the languages, for making the repositories of languages sensitive to diverse demands related to culture and identity, and related to the discussion of heritage in general, related to other aspects of these policies in the countries. So I thank you very much for the attention, and I hope we can have many important discussions in this festival, that we can praise the artists and promote more and more the visibility and centrality of their work. Thank you very much.